Hey guys, this is Isaac Steincamp from Chess Summit Network. It's been a while since I've made my last video. It's been a hectic summer as I'm getting ready to move to college, but I just came back from the World Open a couple of weeks ago. My final result isn't exactly what I wanted. I finished 4 out of 9 in the under 2200 section. I started at 4 out of 6, which I thought was pretty strong, but as the tournament wore on, I was getting tired and I lost the last 3 straight to finish 4 for 9. I learned a lot of things from this tournament, but I also had one really cool game that I wanted to share with you guys from my round 4 against an adult. And I thought it was interesting because it illustrated central dominance as well as the strength of having 2 central doubled pawns in a cluster of 3. So what do I mean by this? Well, let's go to the game. So here in this position, White just played d5, which I thought was an unusual move. Before he was kind of holding the tension, he was waiting for me to kind of see what he did. But when he broke the tension, it kind of showed me that he was uncomfortable with the position. And what were my thoughts on this? Well, my opponent had chosen to play the bishop e3 line of the King's Indian. And when he played bishop e3, bishop g5, and then bishop to d2, and then decide to close the position, well, now you're in a strategic game where it's all about, the pawn pushes. And if you haven't seen my race positions video, I recommend that you watch that too. In order to really be in a race position, your pieces have to be on really strong squares. They're optimized. And right now, my opponent's bishops are doing a really good job of blocking in his own pieces. And it's not quite clear what they're doing yet. So he's made one, two, 3 moves with his bishop to d2. And, he doesn't really have a plan with it. There's no, queen c1 with the idea of bishop h6, as my knight on f7 covers everything. So now it's the ball's kind of in my court. I have to decide how am I going to pursue my advantage. Well, when you're in a race position, you have to make some dynamic moves. So the first move is fairly intuitive, just f5. If my opponent takes, e takes f5, well, I can just play g takes f5 and control the e4 square. And if he does nothing, I just have the move f4. And common sense says that black has to be better because white really has no way of maneuvering around his bishops to create the best defense. Meanwhile, this h3 pawn could be a potential weakness. So black has to be better here. So my opponent decided to take, which is probably the best decision. E takes f5, g takes f5, and then played bishop to f1. And I wasn't so sure about this idea. I thought maybe for a second he's trying to play like g3 and then bishop to g2. But a move like this is really slow. And when he gets his bishop to g2, I can just play the move e4, blocking in the diagonal completely, making it really hard for him to use that bishop. So I kind of saw this as a wasted move. Now, I wanted to put my rook on the g file. This was the whole point of playing g takes f5, as I control the center, but I also have a half-open file. So I thought, well, if I play the move king to h8, this seems very natural, but now my opponent has moved knight to h4. And let's say I continue with my plan with bishop to f6. My opponent has queen to h5, and then all of a sudden it looks like I'm in a little bit of trouble here. White is threatening to win the f5 pawn. White is also threatening knight to g6. And I really don't want to have to trade my dark squared bishop. White can't really be worse here anymore, as I have a lot of dark squared holes. Queen f6 might be coming. He might even have a perpetual already if he wants it. Meanwhile, my pieces are kind of blocked in. My knight on a6, my bishop on c8, my rook on a8 aren't really in the game yet. And surprisingly, this bishop on d2 seems to be pretty well placed. So I kind of realized I couldn't really let this happen. So I made an interesting decision that I kind of like here, and this is this bishop to f6 move. Because now knight h4 is not even possible. Notice how the bishop on f6 also controls the g5 square, so any opportunities for counterplay on the king's side are kind of cut off by my bishop. So all I'm doing is changing the move order. Maybe next move I'll play king to h8. My opponent decides to mix things up a little bit. He plays the bishop to e3. And this is kind of like the first video I uploaded on YouTube where I talked about optimization of my pieces. And my opponent, who was about 1500 at the time, he played like bishop to b5, then bishop to d3, then bishop to f1, bishop e2, bishop d1, bishop c2. We wasted a lot of time. This is kind of the same thing, but at a much higher level. My opponent played bishop to g5, bishop to e3, bishop to g5, bishop to d2, bishop to e3. And it's not quite clear what he's getting out of it. But you have to ask yourself, why is he putting his bishop here? Obviously, my opponent felt like this was a much better square than d2 and made this move first rather than correcting any of the other pieces. Well, I thought maybe white's trying for c5. I thought that this was a potential plan for white. So I looked for the easiest way to kind of stop white from doing this, and that was just to play c5 myself. Obviously, I do a nice job of blocking off the queen side. And if white doesn't take en passant, it's really hard for him to create concrete counterplay as I have central dominance, and I'll just play king to h8 and rook to g8. So my opponent took en passant. I played b takes c6, and now Unlike most King's Indians, where you originally start with a closed position and play on the king side, this position's opened up. My opponent really hasn't developed, and I have a central advantage. So right now, I'm going to play in the center and kind of see what my opponent has to offer. So my opponent played the move queen to a4. And at this point, I was pretty confident that I was better, but I needed to put my pieces on better squares. For example, this knight on f7 was perfectly placed in one of those closed race positions, as I could play g6 to g5 without worrying about giving up a pawn, as the knight on f7 protects it. It also stopped bishop to h6. But at this point in time, it's not really a needed idea, so I need a better square for this knight. I can't really move my bishop yet, as it's protecting the knight on a6, and my knight on a6 doesn't exactly have any squares yet. Maybe at some point I'll play knight to c7, but at least right now my knight on a6 could potentially go to c5, and maybe I want to keep that option. So I just played the move e4. What's the idea? Well, I figured I'm going to create this e5 square. It's a great square for my knight. If my knight can stay on e5, I have the advantage. I can start putting pressure on c4. And meanwhile, my opponent's development's kind of falling behind. Maybe at the right time I can move my bishop to h8 and then play f4 if my opponent's not making the right moves, or if I can, I can also continue with my plan of king h8 and rook to g8. So I just played the move e4, and he played the move bishop to d4. And now is an important strategic decision. Obviously, if I play bishop takes d4 and then my opponent plays knight takes d4, he puts a lot of pressure on c6, and his knight in the center is actually not too bad, and it's not quite clear what I'm getting out of it. So I can't allow this trade. But if I play a move like bishop to d8, this is kind of awkward looking. So instead, I chose what I thought was the best move, knight to e5. And my idea was, it's kind of played out in the game. After knight takes e5, d takes e5, I have doubled pawns in the center, but now this rook on e1 is not as effective because it's not pinning the pawn. So, I can look to maybe push this pawn without worrying about the file opening up on my queen. But the even more important idea is I can control now the d4 and the d5 squares with my pawns, and even the d3 square. So now my knight on a6 is going to look for a way to reroute itself maybe to d4, maybe to d5, kind of see what my opponent has to offer. So my opponent played back to e3. So my opponent's made a lot of moves with this bishop. That's okay. I just played the move knight to c7. The idea is simple. Knight to e6, knight to d4. And now my opponent played c5. So if I just kind of continue with my plan, and I play the move knight to e6, my opponent's going to play the move bishop to c4 and then trade this bishop for my knight. In reality, this isn't too bad, as I'll still have the bishop pair, but I figured in this position, this knight on this d4 square is worth so much more than this bishop on f1. So instead, I just decided to develop my bishop, my last remaining piece. My opponent played bishop to c4. After bishop takes c4, queen takes c4 check, I offered this queen trade, queen to e6. And if my opponent doesn't take, well, maybe I can get an attack going, kind of like what happens in the game. And my thought was, well, if he takes, I have to be better. Let's say he tries to grab the file. I can just put my knight in the center. And if white dare take, now I have two central pawns. I can put my rook behind him, and I already have one pass pawn. Maybe I can make my e4 pawn a pass pawn. This is just crushing. So my opponent didn't opt for this, but in reality, I don't think the alternative was much better. He played back to a4, and now there's really no way to improve my position. I didn't want to play the move knight d5 because I still wanted to keep the idea of knight e6, knight d4, and at bay. So I decided maybe the best first step is to get the king off of this diagonal. So I played the move king to h8. He played rook on a to d1, and I kind of realized here, rook to d6 is a pretty big threat, and in reality, it's kind of difficult to get my knight to d4, but having a knight on d5 is not so bad either. If he takes, then I'll have 4 central pawns, and then I can start playing the move d4. In this position, black has to still maintain the advantage. My opponent played queen to c4, rook on a to d8, king to h2. I played rook to g8, just getting my rook on the half-open file. My opponent played bishop back to c1. Not a move that he would want to make, huh? Well, in this position, I found a really cool move, but I suggest that you pause the video and see if you can't work it out for black. Okay, well, if you haven't solved it yet, keep on thinking, but the move I played in the game was rook takes g2 check. And the idea was after king takes g2, knight to f4, I have an attack on the queen. He played bishop takes f4, and I thought maybe queen takes c4 wouldn't be so bad after rook takes d8, bishop takes d8. I'm looking pretty good, but he does have a rook and a knight to my queen. I want to make sure my pieces are as active as possible, and maybe it's not the best idea to trade off all of my pieces if I'm attacking still. So I threw in rook g8. bishop g3, and now queen takes c4. In all honesty, bishop to g3, this route probably wasn't the best route for my opponent, as, he winds up losing another piece. But, really, what else can he do, right? Maybe he plays a move king to h2, but then I have an active knight on f4. So, queen takes c4, rook d6, bishop e7, rook d7, queen to e6. And now the game is effectively over, so this is just a mop-up. And I'll show the rest just so you guys can see that. Rook on e to d1, f4, knight takes e4, takes, and now I just put my pieces on the f-file. Now that the g-file is closed, I need to still be active. My opponent has a rook on the 7th, so I do need to be a little bit careful, but as long as my pieces are active, I should be okay. Rook takes, queen f5, rook to e1, queen to f3, starting to look at some potential mate threats here, king to h2. Now I play the move bishop takes c5, with the idea that if knight takes, I have queen to f2, and I should be able to pick up the rook and get checkmate. My opponent was sneaky. He played rook takes h7, and if I am not careful and I take this rook, I actually might lose this game now. After a move like, I don't know, king g7, he takes my queen, I take here, he'll take here. He's got 4 pawns to my bishop and pawn, and I don't think I can actually win this endgame anymore. So I can't take the rook, but I saw this, and I rightly decided king to g8. Just don't take the rook. He played back to h4. And now it's just a matter of activating my pieces. Rook to f7. He played a3, which didn't really help his position. Rook to d7. Rook g4. King to f8. And he played rook to c1. And now there's a forced checkmate on the board. Let's see if you can find it. Okay, so the first move is queen to e2 check. King h1. And then kind of counterintuitively, rook d1. Rook takes, queen takes, and after king g2, queen e2, and checkmate's forced. If he plays king to h1, I'll play queen to f1 check, king to h2, queen to g1 checkmate. If he plays king to g1, well, that's illegal. The bishop's here. And knight to f2, queen takes f2, king h1, queen g1 checkmate. My opponent resigned here, and that was that. And I was 2.5 out of 4 going into round 5. So what are my thoughts on this game? Well, I thought this was a really cool way of kind of mixing together a whole bunch of my videos that I had made and putting it into a much more advanced game. The ideas that I had behind this game were at a higher level than my optimization video or my race position video, but I thought the same ideas kind of applied. So if we go through the opening really quick, my opponent moves his bishop around a lot. Bishop e3, bishop g5. This is still main line. Queen e8, h3, f6, bishop d2. Here he played rook to e1, trying to get his rook on the same file as the queen, just knight to f7, d5. And here I have a central advantage. So it's not really about a race position anymore, it's just building my advantages. Bishop f1, bishop to f6, optimizing my pieces, and stopping his counterplay, being prophylactic here. And then here it was just a matter of central advantage. But I thought the instructive idea was this cluster of 3, because once I created these doubled pawns in the center, I don't think white ever had a chance to equalize. I think in the computer already here, black is, at least slightly better, if not much better. And it's not quite clear how he's going to stop my knight on a6 from becoming super active, like it did in the game, from just being on d5. So I thought this was a really cool game, but it also showed the ideas of optimization and trying to actively use all of your pieces. Imagine if in this position, white was able to stop black by using his bishop and his rook on a1. These are pieces that didn't see the game until it was way too late. So this is Isaac Steincamp signing off, and I hope you enjoyed my video.